this is Ram from Crossmind Studio and welcome back to another chapter of Mantaflow series. And today we are going to discuss how to make the simple fire scene that I posted a few days ago on YouTube and Instagram as well. So this is what it's going to look like. Now I'm sure some of you might have already seen this trailer, but just to give you an introduction, so far we have been dealing with very basic parameters and how to create fire and smoke on still objects. But today we are going to detail it out a bit further and deal with a scene where the object is not still but a little bit more dynamic and the fire is going to spread from one point. Now, those of you who are absolutely new to Mantaflow, I would suggest that you watch the first and second chapter before starting with this one, because there were a lot of details that we discussed about the basic parameters and how the simulations work in the first chapter. And also it's very important to understand the shading for this chapter. So I would recommend that you watch those first two chapters before starting with this one, okay? But this is going to be a rather simple tutorial and very short one because we have already covered a lot of stuff in the first two chapters. So this is what it's going to look like. We have one source emitter and which basically is expanding, and the mesh of the emitter is expanding, okay? And that is basically emitting the fire, and this is going to be a quite high resolution fire, okay? The preview is right now on the 256 resolution, but the final preview was a much higher resolution, and I will share that in a bit, okay? Okay, so now just to give you an overview of what is going on in the scene, I'll quickly create a very rough setup and then go back to the final file. So I'll just enable my screencast over here. Okay, yeah, now it's working fine. So basically I created one plane and then I subdivided a few times. Let's make some dense mesh, okay? Now there are several ways to achieve this effect that you've seen in the video, okay? But what basically we need some information in the emitter that looks like it's expanding, okay? It could be vertex weight, it could be a texture, it could also be just geometry being modified with modifiers, okay? So the best way which I found was using mask modifier with vertex weight proximity, okay? So for some reason vertex weight proximity was not influencing the Mantaflow, and even though the fluid modifier stacks in the modifier list, but it's not picking up the vertex weight proximity's output, okay? So let me know if you have solution for that, but the solution that we're going to use is quite simple. So we'll create one plane and we'll also create one UV sphere over here, okay? And give it some more dense geometry, okay? Something like this. Now on the frame 1, I'm going to scale it down quite a bit and give it one scaling key, okay? And go to the frame around 120 and scale it up all the way and give it another key. So we have a source which is expanding, okay? And now in the main plane we are going to create one vertex group, okay? And let's call this one expansion or something, any name that you prefer, and click on assign. Okay, so let's go to the weight paint and just to see. Okay, so all of these vertices are red. That means our vertex group is working fine. And now the interesting thing that you can do is bring one vertex weight proximity modifier on this plane. And in the vertex weight group, we are going to select the expansion, the group which we just created over here. And now we want to influence this group with another object's proximity, to be specific. So we'll choose this sphere over here that we created. Now if I go to the weight paint, now you would see nothing much is happening over here. That's because we need to choose geometry over here. So now you can see, based on the proximity of this geometry, my vertex weight is influenced, okay? So that's interesting. Now we can detail it out even further. I mean, there are a few things we can tweak. We can select the edge mode, face mode, and the influence we can adjust from here, how sharp or how softer you want it to be. There are different fall of types. So all of that you can experiment with. Okay, you can also give it some random fall off. Okay, so I'm going to keep it to something really basic. Let's keep it smooth for now. And also now what we can do is, instead of keeping it so smooth, we are going to use another modifier on this UV sphere over here, and let's make it displace. And in the displace, click on the new texture. Now this texture, let's say sphere displace, let's call it sphere displace. Okay, and go to the texture editor. From here we'll select the same texture and bring one muscle texture to this. Okay, now why we made it like this, and the reason is, if I go to the weight paint now, select this mesh and go to the weight paint, you will see, because this mesh is displaced, all of these vertices are also receiving some effect from this geometry. Just to give you a better example, I'll decrease the size of this one. Okay, now you'll see what is going on over here. So let's decrease the size, and also let's bring one empty object over here. Let's make it cube. Okay, and in the modifier panel for this sphere, instead of local coordinates for texture, I'll use object and assign this object to this empty that we created. Okay, and now what you can do is you can animate this as well. So I'll create a key for this one, location, rotation and scale, and also go to the frame 120 and scale it up something like this. Okay, you can rotate this one as well and move it as well, and create another key. All right, now if I select the plane and the weight paint, so you can see all those smooth lines are distorted now. Okay, that's because we have modifier on this one, the displace modifier. And now if I apply one mask modifier on this one and choose the vertex group expansion, let's go to the object mode. I'll isolate this one and play around with the threshold. You can also invert these values. Okay, now you will see what is going on over here. This is more or less what is going on in the scene. Now to get the perfect results, I'm going to just play around with different settings over here and fall off settings, highest and lowest, until I find some good shapes in this one. Okay, you can also play with the texture size and just play around with all these settings until you find something which looks good and balanced. Okay, alright, so let's jump to the final file over here, and it's exactly the same setup. It's just that you need to play with the right settings. Okay, so I have one plane, and for that I've given it quite a lot of subdivisions, so that when we apply mask modifier, it will have a good smooth shape. Okay, and similar to the example we just discussed, we have one sphere over here, and this scales up, and working with the displace modifier, it creates some noise that is going to influence the weight paints on this one. So I already have one vertex group which is assigned to all the vertices on this plane over here. Okay, if I go to the weight paint, you can see all of these vertices are red. Okay, now if I enable the vertex weight proximity, you will see I have vertex group already assigned over here, and this sphere is influencing the vertex weight proximity. And over here I've used some random fall off just to give it some more noise. Okay, so you can play around with these settings and find the right balance for kind of effect you're looking for. So yeah, we have the base plane and the vertex weight proximity working fine. So I'm going to hide this sphere over here, and just like the example, this sphere over here is also using this empty. Okay, this empty I've assigned for this texture. Okay, for the displace texture. So I animated this empty, and that is what is basically influencing this texture. Okay, so I'm going to hide all these objects, and now let's go to the weight paint. You can also play around with these settings, like how thicker or how thin band you need over here. Okay, now let's enable the mask modifier and play around with the threshold if you need to, but the default settings worked just fine for me. Okay, you can also enable the vertex mode from here if you need some patches instead of a connected mesh. So just so all of that is experimental work. Okay, you would need to play around with these settings. Sometimes there are a lot of happy accidents, so exploring is the best thing you can do. So we have the main emitter mesh ready, and now we are going to simulate our fire on this one. Now, as we discussed in the previous chapters, it's a pretty simple process. I'm going to click on the physics properties and click on fluid over here. Okay, and this brings up Mantaflow. From here, we make it flow object because we want the fire to flow from this object. Okay, and instead of smoke, I'm going to use the only fire this time. Not smoke and fire, just keep in mind only fire. We don't want smoke in the scene, we only need fire. Okay, and change the geometry to inflow. We want continuous flow happening from this one. Okay, so far this looks good, and now we need one domain object, and for that I have already created one domain. It's a simple cube, okay, which is covering all the area that is necessary around this plane mesh. Okay, this looks good enough. I think we need some safe room around this plane just in case some flames go out of the way, and the height is also this much is decent because I don't want flames to reach too high. Okay, alright, so to this cube I'm going to assign one fluid physics properties and change this to domain, and make sure this is set to gas. And for now, for testing purposes, I'm going to keep it 128. Okay, because we are going to make a very high detailed fire, and so I don't want to start with the 32 or 64 for testing purpose. Okay, so I'm going to make it 180, and now I'm going to leave all the other settings to default for now. Okay, and just make sure we have this mode set to modular for now, and I'm going to save my cache somewhere over here. Now that everything is set up, and I'm going to use all the basic settings for this simulation. I'm not going to change any parameters over here because basics work just fine. I didn't have to change much of it. So let's set the resolution to 128 and make sure the adaptive domain is enabled, and make sure you save your cache to somewhere safe. Okay, not in the temp file. And also make sure you are using OpenVDB, and this is good for future practice because OpenVDB is in development and it will be reusable in future if you want to use it, and OpenVDB is good format for that. Okay, so now let's create one preview and see what is going on over here, and it should work as expected. So we have a fire emitting from this source. Okay, looks good. So I'm going to bake few more frames for now and see what happens. Okay, so looks good. I think all of it is working fine. I kind of like the default look. Okay, I don't want to mess it up too much. It doesn't seem necessary. Okay, and I'm sure these flame will look even better when we use the up-res resolution and we increase the subdivisions over here. You will see much more detail going on over here. So right now the motion looks good. I think the more or less the structure is there. Okay, now let's create a higher resolution preview and enable the noise. Okay, in the noise, make sure the strength is set to 0. I don't want the noise to influence the fire. I just want it to make it high res. Okay, and also since there is a little bug that is going on, and it's already being fixed and I have already reported it, but when you bake the noise, the flames are kind of looking weird and it reaches all the way till the top. Okay, now for that, what we can do is we can use the final cache type. Okay, if you bake the simulation and the noise both in one go, so once you're sure of your simulation working fine, with the modular settings, okay, without the noise. Just enable the noise and choose the final from here, okay, and bake it all in the one go, and that way that bug will not be there, and your file should look perfect and without any problems. Okay, so don't worry about it, that this will get fixed very soon. So let's bake it all, and I'll come back when the bake is done. All right guys, so the bake is done, and so this is what simulation looks like. I'll just quickly scrub through the timeline just to show you what is going on. So as you can see, in the higher resolutions, like beyond 256, the flames have much more detail, and the simulation is much more sensitive towards the proximity of the mesh. I mean, the instead of big chunks, it's tightly closing to the surface of this plane over here, and the flames have quite a good amount of details. Over here you can see faded flames, very warm flames over here. So all that we can use in shading, and it's going to look good. Okay, so just to give you a preview, I'm going to show you the shaded version of this one, and we'll discuss this material part in a moment, so don't worry about that. And I'll hide the plane which is emitting the fire. So yeah, I think this fire looks good, but for the example that you've seen in the video, in the trailer, I used a much higher resolution. I actually used beyond 400 or 450 or something. Okay, I think it was 500 resolution fire, and with the 2 resolution in the upres. For this purpose, anything beyond 256 resolution looks good. Okay, if you want something very realistic and something which to look photoreal, then low resolution is not going to work, and 256 or 330 is actually very well balanced resolution for detailed smoke or fire. Okay, so you guys can try it out, and depends on the kind of configuration you are dealing with, and the kind of time you are willing to spend in the baking. Okay, the final bake on the resolution around 400 or 500 took me 7 to 8 hours. Okay, and that was I think that is the max you would want to stretch in terms of the resolution. Okay, so but I think the wait was worth it, and I'm just going to open the final file and show you the results. So I'm not sure on the screen if you will be able to see the much of the difference, but in the render you will be able to make out the slight more defined shapes in terms of the flames and all, working better with the even higher resolution simulations. Okay, so let me open the file for this one, the final one, and all right, so here's the final file, and this one is baked on 500 resolution. So as you can see over here, much more details in the flames, and it gets quite heavy. Okay, I can tell you that it gets heavy. On the higher the resolution is, it's going to be much slower. Okay, but as you can see over here, there are much more details in the overall simulation going on, and the gradation is the density is divided more. I think instead of all those flat values of high density over here are broken down into nice shapes of flames. Okay, so if you can afford to simulate on higher settings, go for it. It's going to look even more realistic. Okay, so I would recommend anything between 256 to around 330, 380 works fine for this kind of scenario. Okay, all right, so now let's make a shader for this one, and the shader is going to be quite simple. All right, so here's the play blast of this sequence, and this is how it should look, and I'm quite happy with the kind of motion and the flames and all, and I think it's going to look pretty in the final render. Okay, alright, so now that we have everything set up, let's make it more exciting and start working on the shader. Now those of you who are working from the second chapter, I mean those of you who have already seen the second chapter, will find this one quite easy, because it's only the fire that we're dealing with. Okay, if you haven't seen the volumetric shading chapter, the second part of the Mantaflow series, I would strongly suggest that you watch that first and then come back to this tutorial later. Okay, so let's click on the new material over here, and this should give us a principled BSDF by default. Now I'm going to delete this one, and bring one principled volume, okay, and connect this one to volume. All right, and preview this viewport over here. Okay, so there's nothing much going on over here, and also you would think about increasing the density over here, but keep in mind we are using the fire simulation and there is not much of the smoke going on over here. For this scenario we don't want any smoke, okay. Alright, so to see the fire flames, what we need instead over here is the emission color, the blackbody intensity, okay, and as soon as I increase this value you will start seeing the flames. But these flames don't look quite good, okay. That's because we are not using any attributes over here at this moment. So I'll just decrease the samples for volume just so that we can see faster previews, okay. Okay, so we have our basic shader, and now what I'm going to do is bring one attribute, okay, and in this one what I want to use is a flame attribute, okay, and let's plug this one into blackbody intensity. So instead of using a flat value, I'll use this attribute to drive this parameter. And as soon as I plug this one in, you can see all those flat colors. Without this, most of these flames look quite flat. They're not using the actual density of the flame. So if I bring this one in, you'll start seeing much more better shapes for the flames over here, okay. And now let's bring one math node and plug this one over here and change this to less than. Now what is going on over here is without this, if I mute this one with M, now even though we have used the flame attribute over here, it's still lighting up all the flames, okay. But if you want to control the shape of the flames a bit more, you can use these math nodes like less than. Now what's going on over here is it's using the threshold, and wherever the density is less than 0.5, only those flames will be visible over here, okay. And this example looks quite closer to the actual real world flames, okay. So it's totally up to your taste, and you are free to explore all these parameters and play around with different settings. That is totally up to you, but 0.5 works just fine, and I'm going to keep that, okay. Now let's make this one multiply and make it around 5. So yeah, we have some strong flames over here, okay, and that's good. Now I'll keep it as it is for now and work on the tint over here. If you see it in the real world examples, whenever there is a flame, okay, in the source and the flame, there is some gap, some sort of transparency, and it's not always sticking to the surface, okay. If you look at the match, or if you burn a paper, there is always some sort of transparency, and the flames will appear as if they are floating in the air, okay. And that's what we want over here to make it more realistic. What we need is we don't want to see this base over here that is emitting the flames. We only want to see these flames and appear as if they are floating right above the surface. So I'm sure there are many ways to do this, but I'm going to bring one gradient texture to do this simple job, and plug that one into blackbody tint. And right now you can see my gradient is working. It's a linear gradient, black to white, okay, sorry, white to black, something like that. And the blackbody tint parameter is quite simple. What is the tint value that you want to use over here? White is going to give you blackbody default colors which work based on the temperature, but if you make it like a blue or something, then that tint basically will work over here, okay. And if you make it black, then the flames will disappear because the black value is considered as 0, okay. So let's plug this one over here, and we want to transform this one with texture coordinates. So since my node wrangler add-on is enabled, I'll press Ctrl T, and this should bring up a texture coordinate and mapping. And I'll rotate this texture to 90 degrees, and now you can see my texture is far in the top, and I want to bring it on the right levels. So I'll start playing around with the X values or Y values, and I mean I had to try a few times to get the right values. So 1.1 works just fine for me. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to control this gradient a bit more with brightness contrast. And right now our gradient is somewhere like from here. Black values are somewhere over here, white values are somewhere over here, because our box is this tall, okay? And I want to tighten those values and only bring around this much transition. Over here I want black values and over here white values. So like again, there are many ways to do this, but I'm going to make it around 1.8, and that should make my gradient work just as I expected it to be, okay? Now just to give you a better example, I'm going to go to the front view and show you what is going on with the gradient. If I make it 2, or let's make it 4, okay, you can see my gradient is working somewhere over here from this point till this point, and I can position this however I want over here from here, okay? And this brightness contrast, if I disable this one, you can see it's much farther spread out gradient, and all this one is doing is making it sharper, okay? So yeah, more or like I think we are done with the shading, and just one addition I want to do with this one, and that is bring one gamma node and plug this one over here. I want the energy of these flames to be slightly more powerful, and this should do. Okay, so this is the shader that I used, and right now our scene looks a bit empty, and I'm going to add a few more things to make it more exciting. Okay, so now that I'm happy with the scene, let's prepare it for the final render. And the first thing I'm going to do is set the composition right, and let's go to the output. I'll use something what you see in the CinemaScope, 21:9, okay? And I have two cameras. One is aligned to the slightly top view, somewhere over here. And another camera is something from the front, okay? This way. Now I'll add one ground plane to the scene, and for that we have our ground plane, which I've already made. Sorry about that. This one, okay? Let me rename this one to ground plane. Otherwise, what's the purpose of having an outliner? A bit more organizing, and we have a ground plane over here, okay? And on this ground plane, I basically used a very simple material which looks let me isolate this ground plane to show you what is going on. Okay, I'll just disable the scene world and bring one brighter light, okay? So this ground plane is using a very basic setup of principled BSDF, and in the roughness I have used a imperfection map which I brought from polygon.com, and you can bring any imperfection map based on depending on what kind of look you are going for, okay? So I'll go to the camera view and enable the depth of field over here, okay? And I want the background edges or some of the flames to be blurred out, okay? And now for depth of field, I have one empty object over here that is that's what I'm going to use. So I'll exit the isolation mode so that we can see what is going on over here. So this empty object over here, okay, I want the camera focus to be somewhere in the almost in the front part, and all these back flame to be blurred out in this view, okay? So I'll select my camera, enable the render, and enable the depth of field, and over here I'll just type empty, okay, and choose the empty that is somewhere over here. I think it's called empty 001. I'll rename this one to camera focus empty. Select our camera, change this to camera focus empty, and this should give us a quite good depth of field, okay? And I'm also using f-stop of 0.1 over here, okay? And this will make background flames blur even more. Okay. For this scene environment, I'm not using any HDR because I'm going for a quite simple look and I don't want any light from the environment. I just want the light to emit from these flames and fill up the scene. That's all. So background, I don't have any HDRs, and yeah, I think I like this setup. And you can see, because of the imperfection map on the ground, I can see some broken flames reflective on this ground. Okay, and this looks good. All right. And one more thing I want to tweak right now is the color of these flames before rendering it. Now, right now, we are using temperature of 1000. And if you render this one, the flames look quite saturated. Okay. Even though this looks decent, it's not looking quite natural. So I'm making it 1200, and this should give me much more natural look to the flames. Okay, I like this color. I played around with different temperature parameters, and I found the 1200 working fine. And I can also bring down the gamma a bit. And yeah, I think this is all we need for now. Now, if we go to the top shot camera, now let's go back to the render settings and make sure to change back your volume settings. Otherwise, in the render, it's going to look low resolution. So now in the latest version of the Blender, we have two different settings: step rate render and in the viewport. Okay, if you want, you can decrease it even further, and this will give you much finer looking flames. Okay, but from this distance, I don't see much of the difference, and I don't want to overburden the render too much. So let's keep it 2, and that should be enough for this purpose. Okay, and one last thing I want to add into this scene is some volume in the environment. Okay, and why that is because right now, if I render this one, we have the fire emitting from the main source. Beyond that, the overall environment looks very dull and blank. We want this light to scatter in the environment, and for that I've created one cube which is basically covering the entire scene, only this much. Okay, and in this cube I have given one volume scatter material. Density of 0.1 is enough. I don't want too much volume in the scene, and you can also play with anisotropy, but default should work just fine. Okay, now see the difference, what is happening over here. If I render it with the fog over here, now the light from this source is going to scatter into this fog, which is in this cube. Okay, and that will add much more depth to our scene, and it will look much more realistic. Okay, because in the real world, whenever the light emits around that, you can see aura, and because in the real world, whatever we see in the surrounding, it's never empty. Okay, there is always some amount of volume in the environment. Okay, so this looks good. I think I'm going to keep it this way and render it out. So once you're sure about everything, just do some test renders on the low resolution before going for the final render. So I think we are good to go, and I just want to make sure everything is working fine in both the views. Okay, for the render settings, I've used 180 for the final render, and that worked just fine. And also I used the step rate render to 2. Okay, and this would decrease the render time a bit. Okay, so yeah, that's about it. And now I'm going to render the scene and come back to you with the final results. So here's the final render, and both the sequences that are rendered, it's the same simulation but rendered from different camera angles. So I took these two sequences and played around with the different compositions and made this sequence that you've seen in the trailer. So that's about it for today, and hope you guys find this useful and you are able to follow along. And those who are absolutely new to Mantaflow and the smoke and fire simulation, I strongly suggest that you watch these tutorials in the right order. Go to the playlist section, or you can also find the link in the description, and watch the chapter 1 and 2 to be able to understand this completely. Okay, and there is another series that is already going on, which is about animated content creation. You can find that as well in the playlist section. So if you are interested into making your own animations and about some stories, then I suggest that you look into that series as well, and I'm pretty sure you will find it interesting if you are into animated content creation. So that's about it for today, and this concludes our chapter. I would love to see what you guys create out of this, and do share your results with me on Instagram. Tag me with Crossmind, and also if you have any doubts, suggestions, do let me know in the comments. I'll try my best to answer as much as possible. So I look forward to see you guys in the next chapter, and I'm working on the chapter number 4 for the animated content creation series, and hoping to upload that within this week as soon as possible. So thank you for all of your support. I'll see you guys in the next chapter. Take care and have a good day.